missionaries, evangelical missionaries, that I wonder if they would give us a discount. Now I know they would give us a discount. All right, there are a number of things. And Pastor, I forgot to ask you, do we try to end about 9:45 till?
Yes.
The hour? Okay. This morning in the presentation, last night, if you were here, gave you just kind of Mormonism 101 that hopefully can be a tool to help you in your witnessing ability. And I realize that and I give Mormonism workshops through the years regularly to help train God's people to become more effective and knowledgeable with regard to questions to ask and so forth. That was just a one-shot thing last night, but hopefully it can still be helpful to you. There are a number of things as I was searching through my repertoire of items to bring, and so I didn't bring a lot of literature, but I did bring some. A number of years ago, we produced a DVD about Joseph Smith. Please help yourself to those. I still had some left. I think if there was one per family, there's probably still enough back there. Those are free of charge. Help yourself to those. The other things on the table is we have a prayer force card. This was an endeavor that we started about 5-6 years ago. And and the goal was that every missionary could raise up 300 prayer warriors to pray for him every day for a year, or a BMW missionary, or BMW itself, okay? And now, if they want to pray every day after a year, that's okay. But the prayer force card also gives you a 5-point outline on the back of how to intelligently pray for missionaries that every missionary needs, okay? And so there's a tab you can tear off, put your name on it, give it back to us if you'd like to be on our prayer force mailing. Now understand there's a difference between our prayer letter that typically goes out quarterly versus prayer force email updates. These are very brief. These are for people who want to pray for us regularly. And so we put you on our prayer force sign up, okay? They're email only, not snail mail. And but even if you don't want to pray for us, that's okay. Help yourself to one of these. They're great bookmarks and remind you of how to pray for missionaries. And of course, we have our prayer card, most recent one. The only thing that's changed is as of January 2022, I no longer serve as U.S. Area Director. And but please help yourself to that if that'll help you remember to pray for us. Now, how many of you in the audience are coffee drinkers? Can I see those sinners? I mean, those prized people? Okay. Likewise, one of our board members in BMW is a businessman. Very godly man that we dearly love. Through him, he led the charge on it because we were launching into Indonesia. And in that field and in that country, they make some of the greatest coffee in the world. And he said, I wonder if there's some way I can leverage providing some of the best coffees, get them over the United States, package them, and then he came up with the name coffeehelpingmissions.com. Okay? Now, I have to give a disclaimer. If you're a Folgers or Maxwell House coffee drinker, this isn't going to work for you. These are specialty coffees. But if you say, I enjoy really good coffees, then this may be something for you, okay? And what I mean by that is you can go to the website. This is how he set it up. He makes no money off of this. That is this board member. So whatever above and beyond the cost to package, ship, because I remember being in this board meeting with him and I said, so Jeff, tell me, so you're going to arrange for ships to bring coffee to America, you package it in your warehouses, and you're going to distribute it. He says, yeah, I can do that. And I thought, I wouldn't even know how to start. But he's a businessman. And so That's how coffeehelpingmissions.com got started. So the way it works is anything above and beyond the cost of it, 50% goes to any missionary that you designate, and 50% goes to Indonesia, because that was the field that we were launching into to help in the church planting efforts. We now have several couples that work in Indonesia. And so you might say, well, isn't this mixing, spiritual ministry with finances and all that? Well, if it's not for you, it's okay. But if it resonates, say, well, if you're going to spend money on drinking good coffee, why don't you use it for God's glory and missions? And so help yourself to those cards. And then also in that Mormonism 101 last night, one of the things we developed several years ago, a couple of our men got together, and that is Mormon missionaries that come to your door, okay? Whether they're male or female. The RM in the corner of these means returned missionaries. Many times they are challenged about their Mormon faith when they're on their mission. Particularly males, they're required to go on a 2-year mission, okay? So that's how Pastor got his suit, at a discount, you see. And but there are questions to ask sister missionaries, and the questions are on the back, okay? And then questions to ask male missionaries, and questions are on the back. So if you want to help yourself to those, have them in the back of your Bible as you have encounters. We developed that as just a tool to be of help to you. So anyway, those are the things that wanted to call to your attention on the back table. Oh, I did fail to mention that with regard to Prayer Force, there's also a sign-up sheet. If you say, well, I don't want to go through the trouble of filling out this card and sending it to the Ganinos or giving it back, just sign up on the sheet. There's a Prayer Force sign-up. If you say, I really mean business about praying for the Ganinos and BMW, and I want to pray for them every day. And you can sign up on that sheet. We'll put you on our email list. For example, I sent a notice right before this trip. I says, please pray for the Ganinos. We're going to be visiting one of our missionary families in New York City and Queens, which we stayed with Thursday night. And then I said, I'm going to be speaking 4 times over this weekend. So I want people praying, because I know the greatest need I have is for God's people to pray. God's people to pray. Do I believe with all my heart that makes a difference? Absolutely. Do I understand all the nuances of how that works with God's sovereignty? No. But I do believe, A, we're commanded to pray, and number 2, that we can participate and partner with God and with missionaries. Because you see, I realize that as I'm on the road speaking, God doesn't call everyone to go, right? Most people are going to stay. You're challenged about missionary work, and I'm not sure why. Oh, there you go. I haven't learned to do 2 things at one time yet, so bear with me. Okay. All right, I think we're good to go. Now, this couple you may not recognize, okay? That's because that was just a few years ago for my bride and I. But we walked right down this aisle. This is where we were married. And so I'm giving you a history of our history with Church of the Bible. This is Elaine's home church. This is where she grew up. This is where her father was chairman of the board for many years. And so God has been very kind to us in that partnership. And like I say, I know that for a number of you that You know, the church went through a rough patch. I get that. Churches go through that kind of stuff. So you had to drop our support, and that's okay. We look to the Lord as our supplier, but ultimately we understand He does that through God's people. But recently, obviously, your pastor notified us that there was some discussion about mission funds and how you folks might appropriately use those, and he notified us that you were going to take us back on support. And so we are incredibly grateful. Whatever that amount is incidental. What we want to endeavor to do is partner with God's people who are serious about missions, who are serious about the gospel, and want to reach lost people for Christ. So as you notice from that picture, we haven't changed a whole lot, right? I got rid of my giant glasses. There's a lot of jokes about my giant glasses when I married Elaine, and I could give you a whole story with her dad and so forth. But we're grateful for the 40-some years that we have served with BMW, and we have served in a number of capacities. So this morning is a history, okay? Walking you through those 40 years. Some of you know part of that. Some of you know none of that. And some of you know all of it. And I'm glad not all of you know all of it. There's only a few, just like our dear friend Peter. But I could tell stories about Peter too, but we won't go there, okay? But we are grateful for your partnership. This is our clan now. God has blessed us with 2 children. Nathan is on what would be your right, and then our daughter Carissa with the shorter dark hair, and then our daughter-in-law next to my son Nathan, Kelly, and then they've blessed us with 3 grandsons. And so they grew up on the field. They don't resent the field. Utah is home for them. They both have full-time jobs. We're happy to report, by God's grace and mercy, as far as we know, they're seeking to honor the Lord. They're serving in their local churches, and we're grateful for God's mercy to them and to us. With regard to some of the people that we have served with, I'm just going to give you an overview of some of those folks. During the last 16 years, we did serve as U.S. Area Director, we had conferences around the country for all of our missionaries. And so we're grateful for all the people that we've served with. This is one of our conferences that was actually on the East Coast in North Carolina last year. And so we thank the Lord for all the teams of missionaries and co-laborers that we have served with. And part of the reason why I want to give you the history, beloved, is that this is part of the fruit that you have prayed for. Okay? This is what you've done by being at the throne of grace, interceding on our behalf. You're a part of all that. We don't do this Lone Ranger style. We do this. And part of the history also, may I suggest to you, is this. Those of you that did know Bob Larkin, Elaine's father, know that he was a Marine. My father served in the Italian army under Mussolini. I also was in the army. So we have a long history of military family experience. Because of that, we learned very early the incredible sacrifice that people make to come to America, particularly back then, to live the American dream. Let me give you 2 instances that are part of my DNA in being born in Italy. My father, ultimately, my uncle sponsored our family to come to America, because back in those days, you had to be sponsored by someone who was already in America. And so they sponsored our family. But my father came over 2 years before we all did. That is, Mom and the 4 boys. And we were all born there. So Dad came over 2 years prior and to get a job, earn some money, send money home. And ultimately then Mom and the 4 boys got on a ship 9 days later, we arrived at Ellis Island. During those 2 years, Mom and Dad were apart. An incredible sacrifice for them, all for the possibility of the American dream. There was another time where a sacrifice was made, and that was during World War II. Mom hadn't heard from Dad in 2 years. Now, as hard as it might be to believe, those of you that are under 40, that was before payphones. That was before cell phones. That was before the internet, okay? And so how did you communicate? When America came to the rescue of Italy under the dictatorship, when the Nazis invaded Italy, and America came to the rescue, my dad came to America with a great sense of duty and obligation to America because of what America had done for him. But Mom hadn't heard from him in 2 years. Then after 2 years, the war ended. Dad was way up north in northern Italy. And so you don't hop on a bus or a train. Nobody picks you up at the airport. And so he would walk a day or two, stop and work for a farmer, get some meals, walk another day or two, worked his way all the way to southern Italy where we lived. And in the middle of the night, he walks into our home and said, "Angeline, get up, I'm home." Mom hadn't heard from him in 2 years. As far as she knew, he died in the war, but he didn't. And I've often thought of that because that's part of my DNA. Sometimes when it comes to the price and the power of the gospel, which we're going to preach about this morning in our service, I believe in some ways, not always, but in some ways, we're a little soft about understanding the price of the gospel. Now, having been involved in missions for 40 years, I understand very clearly, perhaps more clearly than the average, of what some of our missionaries are paying at a great cost to share the gospel with people who have never heard. We're pretty comfy this morning, right? You're in comfy seats, you're in a heated building, and I still remember a conversation many years ago I had, because when we would get together twice a year in Atlanta, I would be able to rub shoulders with the other area directors from other countries. And I remember visiting with the one, and I said, "Bill, I'm just curious, what is your favorite country to be in with believers?" And he said, "Hands down, New Zealand." He says, "Man, we meet under thatched roofs, but man, when the New Zealanders sing, they sing with all their heart." And I thought, isn't that cool? They have a great sense of what people expend by way of energy, resources, and sacrifice to bring the gospel to them. Sometimes churches get off track about what's the most important, right? We get sidetracked. I get that. I get sidetracked because there's a lot of stuff that distract us. But many of these folks, they serve the military, they serve international students on campuses, they served the deaf and deafblind on some of our other conferences, but many times they do it at a great cost. And I still remember the day we left for the mission field. My family back in those days, they did not understand why we would leave home. We were the first ones to leave Michigan. And why we would do that when I could take a pastorate anywhere. But by that time, I had spent 2 summers in Utah, and I knew that that's what God had placed on my heart. This is our Utah team, not too long ago, and we're grateful for each one of them. When we first went to the field in the early 80s, there was a handful of our missionaries that could sit around one table. Now God has grown that team, but the population of Utah has grown exponentially as well. And so there's still a great need. And this is the most recent church that we planted. With regard to our church planting efforts, we have served in 4 places. And I just realized I brought up the wrong PowerPoint. Would you pardon me for just a minute? I have too many on there. And so we're going to flip through these first slides. So pardon, I had too many icons on there and I opened up the wrong one. But anyway, as we've served the last 16 years, the three biggies that we have been involved in and is are we there now? Okay. Enlist, equip, and encourage. Because as we've gone back twice a year to the Atlanta headquarters, we have helped train younger missionaries who are come as candidates, are going to go out under the umbrella of BMW, and we help with the training. Okay. After we planted our most recent church plant, I was postured to go plant again. That's part of my DNA. I love planting. Going into cold turkey in a community that doesn't have a gospel witness and start from scratch. And there's been plenty of times through the years where my family is the only one that I'm preaching to. But I love that. There's all those firsts that you go through. And we don't have guys breaking down the doors to start churches in Utah, but that's part of what I've always enjoyed. And of course, there's our famous picture. God has blessed us with two children, Nathan and Carissa. And I already shared with you the extended family who we serve with. This is part of our history. We serve under Biblical Ministries Worldwide, which headquarters is in Atlanta, Georgia. We have missionaries who serve in 44 countries, over 500 missionaries, and we have over 20 families in Utah that do church planting. And we have been serving, as of this year, 40 years with BMW. These are the four churches where we have served. We started out in the early 80s in Blackfoot, Idaho. Then we went down to Cedar City, Utah. During that time there, we partnered with another couple, and through 4 pastors, we founded a camp, because for years, all the churches in Utah that were of our stripe all sent their kids to a northern camp. And as we were planting more and more churches down south, that was becoming very cost prohibitive. And so we began searching and praying that God would give us a piece of property in southern Utah. And so that was just outside of Cedar City. And if you want to hear that story, it was an incredible story. But now, since 1987, hundreds of kids have gone through that camp, been saved, are now out serving the Lord. Great, great blessing of God. And then we went to Richfield, Utah, where we started from scratch. And then the last church is in Eden, Utah. From 2005 to the present, we have been serving as U.S. Area Director, which primarily involved care and oversight of our team of missionaries serving in the U.S. And during that time, our missionary team on U.S. soil grew from 23 families to 53 families. So that was a good growth spurt, but I realized that it was going to take more than one couple to do it as we handed over the baton, and God in His grace provided others to serve in that capacity. That responsibility ended officially as of January 22, and these are some of the dear people that we have served with. In the top left, that's our Utah conference. Bottom left, that's the team of U.S. area directors that we've served with for those 16 years, and then also the Eastern Conference that I mentioned earlier. Now, what about our future ministry moving on from 2022 and beyond? You say, well, Dom, isn't it time for you to retire? Let me give you a little education about missionary, not only missionary philosophy of missions, but also the mindset of churches today. When we became missionaries, this was the mindset. Missionaries never retire. How many of you heard that? Anybody ever heard that? Missionaries never retire. Okay, a few of you. And also, churches never wanted to hear you say, I'm now retired as a missionary. Because when you're in ministry, when do you retire from ministry? Well, ministry is a part of your life. That's part of your DNA. You minister to people all the time, regardless of whether you have an official capacity or not. Is that right? And whether we're lay person in the pew or we're vocationally in ministry. And so those of you that have followed our ministry, some 8 years ago, we started a renovation of the apartments that our deaf and deafblind live in our LA complex. And I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. And when I took over that ministry, and being in construction all my life, I thought, this is not a good testimony. These were built in the 50s. There's been no updating done. Now, I realize many of them are deaf and blind, and I realized that I was up against that mindset even with our missionaries that served there. But my mindset was, but there's family who are hearing and seeing that come visit. And these apartments have never been updated, okay? So we began that process. There were 22 that had to be updated, and we started that. There are 4 apartments left. So I've brought in and coordinated teams from all over the country, from East Coast to West Coast. I hook up with them for a week. I rendezvous with them from Utah. I lead that work team. We can put an apartment together in a week, and then they can go back and feel like they made a great contribution. Secondly, focus on the Utah field a little bit more that I couldn't do when I was U.S. Area Director. Focus a bit more on the local ministry that we started back in 1999, Fellowship Bible Church, and then focus on leading the Parsonage Project that I'll show you in a minute. This is one picture of the work in LA where we house deaf and deaf-blind. And it's quite a large complex. It has 2 buildings. The one was built in the 50s, the other was built in the 80s. We did not target to renovate the apartments and the ones that were built in the 80s. They're still in good shape, but we were spending a lot of money on maintenance on the ones that were built in the 50s, okay? And so we started that renovating process. Now, this is what they look like before. Now, please, I don't want to offend anybody. You say, well, that's exactly what my bathroom looks like, okay? Now, in its day, they were great, okay? Pink and turquoise, that worked. Today, that doesn't work, okay? And so I would look around, and then I knew that what the bottom line of how much money we were spending in maintenance, because things were old. And so we had the same dilemma, and this is what the bathrooms look like when we're done, okay? And it's a wonderful blessing for not only those who come and help with the renovation, but also for those who are residents. This is what a sample of what the kitchens look like. They're dark. Those cabinets are solid oak, but they're flat-faced. And so what we do, we settled on a moderate upgrade. That is, we paint the boxes. I order new cabinet doors, and they are shipped, and we put them in. We install new countertops, new sinks, new hardware, and this is what they look like after we're done. And so those of you that have followed our ministry, you know that we've been involved in this for the last 8 years or so. So I've made many trips to LA. Do I like LA? No. But I love that ministry. Our missionaries, they minister to a group of people so small, incidental, but monumental in God's heart. Because in many cases, they are outcasts from society. Family doesn't know what to do with them when they're deaf and blind, if they don't want to learn sign language. And they can come to a loving atmosphere where our missionaries love on them. And they can experience independent living in their own apartment. They have to be highly functioning, but they can cook, they can wash, they can take a taxi, they can take a bus, and they're, in many cases, deaf and blind. And they've taught me so much about learning to be grateful when they have so little. And our missionaries do an incredible job. And as I said before, this is the last church that we planted, and we started services in a rental facility in 1999. 2004, we built a facility, and that is still the facility today. But in April of this year, we had a groundbreaking for a parsonage. And just to give you a little bit of backdrop for this, back in 2010, we finally, after much searching for 2.5 years, we found my replacement. I was ready to move on. At that time, I was ready to plant again. And then that's when our mission agency, BMW, approached Elaine and I and said, we already know you can plant churches. What we want to do in your last, perhaps, decade of life is to help train our candidates how to do church planting. So we want to use you on the home office level as well as on our fields to train others to do church planting. So we're asking you to not plant again because they know how all-consuming a church plant is. Well, my first thought was, I remember after being asked that night, I went to bed weeping. And I remember the next day our general director said, well, Dom, you got to sleep on it. What do you think? And I said, Paul, I went to bed sobbing. The reason why is you're asking me to leave what I love doing. Going in cold turkey to towns to plant a church. And now you're asking me to train others, and although I don't want to do that, Elaine and I will pray as they had asked us. And so we did, and through that, obviously, we not only found my replacement, he's been there since 2010, just a very gifted and talented young man. And then 5.5 years ago, we brought on an associate. That associate, we've been paying rent for him for 5.5 years, because things, as is true probably across the country like here, real estate has just gotten out of control where we live. If we hadn't bought 22 years ago, we would never be able to afford a place now. And so as we began to think about options, we thought this young family with 3 young children, they'll never be able to afford a place up here. We've been throwing money down the toilet for 5.5 years in rent. What about if we approached the county that we could build a parsonage, which I know is old school, I get that, but we could build a parsonage for a fraction of the cost. I become the project manager, which they voted me in to do since I've been in construction all my life. We do 75 to 80% of it all in-house, and we hire out other things that we need expertise in. So we had that groundbreaking in April, and that's me, pastor, asking me to lead in prayer for that dedicatory prayer as we had groundbreaking that day. That was a great thrill. And Elaine and I weighed that very carefully. I thought I had one more in the tank to be able to do. So we broke ground in May. We had the groundbreaking ceremony, but then we broke ground in May. And of course, there's a number of things that we hired out, but for the most part, we've done it ourselves. And this is what it looks like today. Actually, we're further along because now it's dried in and roofed. We have doors and windows. We just completed last week the installation of the drywall. We had a guy out from Michigan to help us finish the drywall. I have another team arriving next Saturday that will complete the siding. And then Saturday after that, another team arriving to hang all the doors and trim. And and we're still under budget. Our goal was, if we don't finish the basement, this is 1,550 square feet per floor, just a ranch with a full basement. And if we decide to finish the basement, the goal was 250. If we don't finish the basement, the goal was 203. We're still under budget. Grateful to God. And we have raised in-house, between God's gifts from outside and inside, we've raised 140 in cash. And so God's been very, very generous, and God's people have been also. And so we're grateful. So that, understand that since May, that has occupied my schedule pretty much full time. If I'm not working on the project, I'm coordinating teams, I'm scheduling things, and ordering supplies, because as you well know, everything's as a shortage, right? We had gas line installed. I called the gas company. Okay, we got the gas line installed. We're ready for you to set the meter. Oh, we have a problem. There's a shortage of meters. And I thought, really? And they said, we're lucky if we get them in a month. And of course, we've been up against that the whole time. But anyway, that's just kind of a history. I could give you a lot more history. I did leave a few minutes for questions you might have. In those 16 years, by the way, I was going to give you a little bit of a backdrop. When we finally said yes to the mission, that, okay, if in God's grace and mercy He grants us 10 more years of life, maybe I can plant one more church. But how can I multiply myself through other younger families by helping to train them to do church planting? The Lord's the only one that knows that. I don't know that. But that's when we jumped on board and been helping to train up until this last year candidates that come to the home office. So during those 16 years, we saw our role kind of like what you read about, that probably many of you have read about, the story in Exodus chapter 17, when Joshua was fighting against the Amalekites. And you remember Moses was up on a hillside, and as long as he held up his arm and his staff, Israel would be victorious. But over time, Moses' arms became tired, right? And what happened? Well, we have there preserved for us that Aaron and Ur came alongside to hold his arms up with his staff so that Israel can be victorious. I think of that in the role that we played over the last 16 years in helping to train others. Also, because of our military background, I understand that there is no soldier or airman or whatever department of the military. When you talk about that soldier that's on the front lines, there are dozens and dozens, and maybe even hundreds behind the scenes that are helping him to be successful on the front lines. We would never send a soldier on the front lines without backup. Never do that, right? And being in the Army aspect, I understand how important the air protection of the Air Force is for the Army troops that are on the front line. You see? May I suggest to you, as you think about praying for missionaries, you remember when Desert Storm took place? I had never heard of George Schwarzkopf prior to Desert Storm. And all of a sudden, he was on all of our TV screens, right? We thought, wow, this guy, he really knows his stuff. Where has he been? But what I learned through that, in contrast to World War II and beyond, is when we wanted to bomb an enemy, we just blanket bombed. But through Desert Storm, we learned that now these rockets can pinpoint targets, even be put through a window of a home or a door to pinpoint that target, that enemy. And of course, that was mind-boggling to me, being an Army guy. I thought, well, why didn't we have that when I was, my number came up for Vietnam. We didn't have that kind of technology. I want to use that backdrop of how we have held up the arms of other missionaries, but also for you, to give you a purpose in praying for missionaries. And that is, think of those Scud missiles you can pinpoint. In pinpointing, you not only partner with God and with that missionary to soften the ground before the troops ever arrive. You can also prepare the soil of the hearts of those who that missionary is going to go to in a very pinpointed way. And by the way, this card I gave you, part of that 5-point outline, helps you to do that. And so just like a Scud missile that can be pinpoint its target in contrast to World War II, so likewise, we have not only the ability and the freedom, but the technology. And yes, good and bad, social media to send out prayer requests. That's part of what Prayer Force is all about. We want God's people praying alongside of us. So we just have about 2 minutes, questions you might have. I've been doing all the talking, but I just wanted to give you a history and a background of our life and ministry. And we still live in Utah. Utah is home. I grew up in Michigan. Elaine grew up, obviously, in New Britain. And but now Utah is home for the last 40 years. And we count it a great privilege to the rich life of ministry the Lord has given us. Questions? Yes, Caitlin.
How many churches does BMW have in Utah and Idaho?
Presently, there are 10 which are pastored by BMW missionaries. And there are also, I'm guessing, it's a good question, but it's probably about 6 to 10 that have been released and graduated. For example, Fellowship Bible Church, the last church we planted, they graduated about 4 or 5 years ago. That is, they graduated from being a mission church. They are autonomous. They are self-supporting, self-governing, and that's the goal. Our goal is not to hang on to churches forever. Our goal is to plant and then turn them loose. And and a number of Utah churches, that has happened. Yep. Maybe as a short excerpt from the church planting efforts, when we went to the field, the goal was to reach a state for Christ. Now I realize that might be a foreign concept to you, okay? But we wanted to reach a state for Christ. And so our primary goal was to plant churches up and down the I-15 corridor, okay? If you know anything about Utah, I-15 goes right down the center of the state. And so our goal was to plant churches that were 2 hours away from each other from north to south. By the early 90s, we had accomplished that. But by the 90s, the population had exponentially grown. So now we find ourselves going back into the metropolitan areas to do more church planting, because now you've got hundreds of thousands of people that you're dealing with, as opposed to tens of thousands when we first went to the field. So we're now shifting our attention more back north again to continue church planting, because now we want to duplicate our efforts in a more metropolitan area. And so we still have a lot of communities. One time, probably 15 years ago, we drew a map around Salt Lake City metropolitan area. We divided it up into 4-mile quadrants, okay? We wanted to find out what churches are in that 4-mile quadrant that are like us. They're not exactly like us, but they're preaching the gospel, they're teaching the Word of God, because we don't want to duplicate efforts in a 4-mile square. And that was very helpful. And so obviously church planting in Utah has become a lot more popular in recent years, and a lot more churches have been planted outside of what BMW has done. But I just wanted to, we're always strategizing about how can we leverage our people and our resources to be more effective in church planting in Utah. All right, well, thank you for your attention. I want to leave plenty of time between now and the service. Help yourself to any of that literature on the back table. And if you have questions for Elaine and I, we stand ready to answer those as we can. So, Lord bless you. You're dismissed.